For a long time, we criticized power using only certain symbols: thrones, armies, and conquered cities. But the real power existed completely outside of what we thought we knew. It had no king, no capital, no standing army, and no single ruler issuing commands. And yet it set prices, decided who could enter markets, punished kings, and determined which cities would prosper and which would collapse. Its influence stretched from London to Novgorod, from the North Sea deep into the Baltic. This was not a country drawn on a map. It was a network, a system created by merchants who figured out something most rulers had not yet realized. Whoever holds the key to trade also holds power, and power comes to you on its own. Welcome to Money Chronicles. This is where money, power, and history collide. And the things that look simple are usually the most complex. To understand how the Hanseatic League emerged, we need to stop looking at medieval Europe through romantic lenses. There were kingdoms, but there was no stability. After the fall of Rome, Northern Europe was a fragmented chaos of weak states, rival princes, city lords, and overlapping feudal claims. No one really knew who owned the land. Cross a river, and the laws would change. Justice depended on who controlled the road you were standing on. Trading had become an act of courage. Trade was possible, but it came at a very high cost. Pirates roamed the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans faced tolls, confiscation, or outright robbery. A merchant could load a ship with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port, not because there was no demand, but because there was no protection. Kings loved taxing trade when it passed through their lands, but they had little interest in protecting it once it crossed their borders. Cross-border contracts meant almost nothing. If an agreement was broken in another city, there was often no court willing or able to enforce it. But the profits were so great that no one could walk away from trade. Northern Europe had exactly what the rest of the continent needed most: timber for ships and cities, grain to feed growing populations, furs, amber, fish, salt, wool. Demand was rising, cities were growing, trade routes were forming, whether rulers wanted them or not. What was truly missing was trust. Trust between strangers. Trust across different languages, laws, and loyalties. And in this world, trust was extremely scarce. Merchants stood at a crossroads, either remain permanently vulnerable or build their own system of protection. The seed of the Hanseatic League was neither ideological nor political. It was entirely practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They shared ships for security. They traveled in convoys. They warned one another about dangerous ports, corrupt officials, and risky waters. This solidarity gradually turned into strategy. Cooperation reduced risk. Lower risk reduced costs. Lower costs increased profits. And merchants realized something crucial. Acting together was more profitable than competing against each other. Over time, these relationships hardened. Cities that protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that didn't were left outside the trade routes. Trade routes were no longer shaped only by geography, but by trust. Lübeck became a hub thanks to its key position between the Baltic and inland Europe. Hamburg connected river trade to the North Sea. These cities were powerful not because they had armies, but because they were indispensable. There is a very important point here. The Hanseatic League was not designed by anyone sitting at a table. There was no founding document, no declaration, no moment where someone announced, "A new power is born." It emerged like markets do, naturally, driven by incentives. Merchants aligned because it made economic sense. Cities supported them because trade brought wealth. Over time, expectations formed. Expectations became rules, and rules became power. And something critical happened. Trade stopped being just an economic activity. It became a tool of regulation. If enough merchants stopped trading with a city, that city suffered. Prices rose, goods disappeared. Revenue collapsed, not through force, through exclusion. This was the genius of the Hanseatic League. It didn't try to replace states. It worked around them. It didn't overthrow kings. It made them dependent. Kings controlled land, but merchants controlled access. And access to grain, timber, salt, and credit, was far more important than castle walls. By the 13th century, this network covered dozens of cities across northern Europe. They spoke different languages. They answered to different rulers. But when it came to trade, they acted as a single body, not because they were ordered to, but because the system rewarded it. This was the birth of a new kind of power. A power that didn't derive legitimacy from God or bloodline. A power that didn't require conquest. A power born from logistics, trust, and collective pressure. The Hanseatic League was not a cartel in the modern sense, but the foundations were there, and over time, it grew bolder. If merchants could protect themselves, coordinate trade, and enforce rules across borders, how much did they really need kings? Contracts, measurements, and trade rules became standardized. A deal made in Bruges could be understood in Bremen. This wasn't cultural harmony, it was economic alignment. And that alignment created a level of efficiency medieval states simply couldn't provide. In foreign cities, trading centers called contours were established. The Steelyard in London, Bruges, Antwerp, Novgorod, they weren't embassies, but they served a similar function. Disputes were resolved internally. Negotiations were conducted collectively. And this is where the difference became clear. A single merchant could be crushed, but a network controlling vital trade could not. When a city broke the rules, the response wasn't a petition. It was an embargo. Ships changed course. Goods vanished. This was economic warfare without bloodshed. The Hanseatic League avoided violence whenever possible. Because violence was expensive, its weapon was discipline. And that discipline was enforced not by morality, but by profit. Kings eventually learned a hard lesson. Sovereignty meant very little when markets turned their backs on you. Of course, not everyone loved the Hanseatic League. Local merchants resented it. Kings were uneasy with its autonomy. Yes, it sometimes behaved like a cartel. But no one had the power to stop it. Because the Hanseatic League wasn't powerful due to conspiracy. It was powerful because it solved a problem no one else could. In a world where states couldn't provide trust, it did. Where law didn't function, it created norms. Where security didn't exist, it reduced risk. People didn't join by force, they joined out of necessity. By the 14th century, the League was negotiating with kings as an equal. It blockaded ports against the King of Denmark, and it won. Yet it never became a state. No capital, no army, no center. Its power came not from centralization, but from alignment, and that understanding lasted for centuries. Eventually, as states grew stronger, sea routes shifted, and Atlantic trade rose, the League slowly faded. But the lesson it left behind is crystal clear. You don't need sovereignty. You need coordination. You don't need an army. You need control over access. You don't need ideology. You need the right incentives. The Hanseatic League ruled Northern Europe not by decree, but by necessity. And often, that is the most durable form of power. If this perspective gave you something new, don't forget to follow. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.